The Godzilla series is a cycle of feast and famine. In 1954, the original classic and artistic Gojira was then followed by the weak sequel the following year, and then the Americanized version successful enough to even return to Japan in the new form. But after 1956, Godzilla was on ice, or more precisely, in ice, until 1962, with his return in King Kong vs. Godzilla. This return kicked off the most famous Godzilla run, which ended in 1975 with Terror of Mechagodzilla. After nearly a decade away, the monster appropriately returned in Return of Godzilla for another run, which ended with the Arnold Schwarzenegger-sounding title of Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. After TriStar's infamous Matthew Broderick version, the Millennial Era began for Godzilla, ending on the character's 50th anniversary with Godzilla Final Wars. Nearly 9 months before the film's release, though, the studio was already announcing the character would once again be shelved for at least 10 years, citing poor ticket sales for the recent films. Though they did say that if this was the end of an era, it was going to go out with a bang. The unprecedented 2 billion yen budget resulted in a controversial film. It was kind of the Phantom Menace of Godzilla, more successful in wider markets than it was with its fans, and helped by the viral interest generated by the fact that Godzilla would fight and defeat the iteration from the TriStar film. But unlike with Destroy All Monsters, which was supposed to end the Godzilla series but was so successful Toho wound up making 6 more, Final Wars wasn't able to bring in the returns to justify reversing their decision. The public had spoken. It was time for Godzilla to take a break. In a demonstration of just how serious this was, the water stage on the Toho lot was destroyed, burning the bridge thoroughly by eliminating such a central element of so many Godzilla films. Yoshimitsu Banno, who had directed Godzilla vs. Hedorah more than 30 years earlier, negotiated for the right to make a 3D version, which over time snowballed and, in the end, wound up helping to spawn the 2014 Godzilla version by Legendary. Banno executive produced that film and passed away before his Godzilla vs. Hedorah sequel could be realized. Unlike the TriStar version, which remained a punchline for those in or out of the Godzilla fandom, the 2014 film was much better received, and even against stiff competition managed to make a profit, launching Legendary's Monsterverse. The hype around the coming films was driving interest back in Japan, and with the film's financial success, the announcement was made that Toho had been quietly working on a new Godzilla picture themselves. The Monsterverse would still continue, but this would be a homegrown take on the iconic figure. The announcement mentioned 2 big names would be behind the creation of the new film. I mentioned with Godzilla vs. Biollante that in the 90s, Godzilla was seen as sliding in popularity, while the character usually dismissed as a ripoff, Gamera, was amazing Japanese audiences and charming American ones. Well, Shinji Higuchi had been responsible for the visual effects on this trilogy of Gamera films, praised for establishing a whole new standard for miniatures. He was announced as being visual effects director as well as director. Joining him with the titles of supervising director and screenwriter was none other than Hideaki Anno, most famous for our purposes as the maker of Evangelion. It's beyond the scope of this to get too much into that anime. Just know that it is a bit of a complex work that has been revisited and reworked by Anno, and reflective of the creator perhaps more than art usually does. Anno had created theatrical adaptations of his series, but when he completed the 3rd Evangelion film in 2012, he says a depression took over. The culmination of 6 years of hard work. It was to the point that he just couldn't return to the studio anymore. Not for an entire year. He just couldn't do it emotionally, especially knowing that he needed to make a 4th Evangelion film. In January 2013, Toho approached him about working on Godzilla, but he turned them down. He wasn't in the right headspace for something like that, and besides, he was trying to get himself back together to work on Evangelion 4, the next film that he needed to make. Yet the more he thought about it, the more he started to reconsider. Godzilla wasn't one of his own creations. It was actually something much bigger than him. It was a real honor, he realized, that he'd be crazy to pass up. Plus, he'd worked with Higuchi before. Knowing that he would be partnered with a solid creative individual was strong incentive. Higuchi was already enthusiastic about the project. He'd actually done some assistant visual effects work on Return of Godzilla, so it was exciting to return to the franchise as a central creator on the brand new film. By May of 2013, Anno put together the story ideas for what was being referred to as G Project Memos. It was well underway by the time Toho made the announcement, clearly showing they didn't make the decision because of the legendary picture version, but rather making use of the publicity that it brought to spread awareness that Godzilla was back, and was not going to be the Godzilla that we'd been getting in those final years. Film historian David Callett compared Final Wars to children hopped up on sugar playing video games while rock music blared. Quote, "This movie is not about anything. The story is merely a framework upon which the artist has draped a succession of high-octane and mostly absurd scenes." Anno seemed to agree, not just with that film, but the way the series had been going before that. Godzilla exists in a world of science fiction, not only of dreams and hopes, but he's a caricature of reality, a satire, a mirror image. Recently, Japan has also been careless in the way it has attempted to depict him. As discussed in my look at King Kong vs. Godzilla, science fiction fans and kaiju fans face a dilemma. The original Gojira was cinematic art. None of the other films can hope to do what it does as well as it does. It was what we could point at and show that kaiju could have cinematic merit. But to then look at the other films which are not serious cinematic masterpieces and disparage them places us unwittingly in the camp of those who dismiss them too. Those who regard kaiju or superheroes or space action as being childish because they have the unmitigated gall of being fun. Callett's remarks are not a criticism of Final Wars. It's actually a neutral observation. He's just noting that the film is unapologetically itself. Anno's story would attempt to walk the line. On the one hand, there is a quality to the film that embraces the joy of kaiju smashing. Buildings, war vehicles, trains. The destruction is like a child's wish list of how they would like to see the monster smash or be smashed. But on the other, Anno went back to the idea of the original, but in a whole new way. What he wisely did was his script approached the radiation aspect of it without feeling the need to be tethered to the original's allegory with it. It might seem sacrilege to not have Godzilla be the symbol of the atomic bomb's devastating power, and to be the height of arrogance to presume that one could come up with a convenient substitute in a modern crisis. But Anno approached this in a smart way. He didn't attempt to make it about the allegory. He used the allegory idea to create, emotionally, the effect that the event used as the inspiration created. Work began on the story only 2 years after the Tohoku earthquake, which had left 18,000 dead and for a time another 10,000 missing before eventually being found. It wasn't just a natural disaster. It shook Japan. When Gojira came out, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was 9 years old. It was a shared national moment. Anno wisely recognized that the events of 3/11, between the earthquake, the tsunami, and the radiation aftermath from the power plant, had been a powerful shared moment for his time. Trying to tap into the symbols of the event to recapture the moment made Godzilla terrifying in an entirely new way. People for whom World War II was their great-grandparents' history could get what the allegory was now. The sense that You are powerless before a relentless and uncaring force of nature. The tagline for the film that appeared in some places combined these two approaches, back to the days when the titles declared the opponents like a wrestling match, but also that this was about devastation. The tagline was simply Japan versus Godzilla. Nothing is superfluous, Anno explains. The films made in the 1970s and 80s were full of love subplots and human interest angles, but this time there's no romance at all. The film was shopped overseas as Godzilla Resurgence, but in Japan it was now Shin Gojira. The titles were written in phonetic katakana, meaning that while the obvious meaning would be New Godzilla, they could also mean True Godzilla or Evolved Godzilla, even God Godzilla. Realizing the monster was a tremendous challenge. First, the decision was made to go even bigger. The original Godzilla was 50 meters tall. The 1984 creation enlarged that to 80. But the final version of Godzilla in this film would reach 118.5 meters in height, nearly twice that of the National Diet Building that King Kong had been able to climb around on during his matchup with Godzilla. What made this easier to pull off was the decision to use CG for Godzilla rather than the suitmation that was synonymous with the series. It still used men in suits, but strictly to serve for motion capture work. Attempting to do that with regular suitmation, due to the enormous size of the monster, would have required scaling down the elements substantially and interfere with the realism of the effects. In order to achieve what the story was going for in terms of emotions, the effects needed to minimize how much the audience was distracted by them. It was still intended to look like a man in a suit. Anno was insistent on that point. But to not look like a man in a suit jumping around on miniature trees and paper buildings. Higuchi described the approach as hybrid, and that it was what he'd used on his then upcoming Attack on Titan. They did try experimenting with upper body animatronics, but that didn't work out. Mansai Nomura, a noted actor in Japan actually, provided the body movement of Godzilla, which was a surprise considering he's more known for performing in a style of theater that is known for comedy rather than for terrifying monsters. And yet, that was nevertheless the goal. It was horror and not comedy this time. Higuchi said that he wanted to make, quote, the most terrifying Godzilla that Japan's cutting-edge special effects movie-making can muster. Part of this was giving Godzilla a Borg-like aspect, adapting as he goes along to counter his seeming weaknesses. As a result, Godzilla mutates numerous times throughout the film, and not just with his abilities, but completely transforming his appearance. This not only gave Godzilla the body horror angle and a changing aspect that seemed like it came straight out of an anime in terms of its wild style, but also led into the hopelessness of the situation. Every time you think you've found a way to beat it, it has the ability to mutate and remove the weakness. Higuchi said his goal was to give the audience nothing less than their greatest, worst nightmare. Higuchi wasn't the only one that Anno had previously worked with. Handling the music was none other than Shiro Sagasu, who'd done music for both Evangelion and Nadia the Secret of Blue Water. By design, the soundtrack drew upon Evangelion's soundtrack. Much like how Evangelion itself had drawn on Nadia, it was something that he and Anno liked doing. But Anno also wanted to bring in some of Ifukubei's work as well. He'd actually listened to it while working on the screenplay. He even tried to get some of it adapted from mono into modern stereo, but it proved too daunting, so he settled for the mono mixes. The result of all of this hard work hit theaters in 2016, and to much acclaim. But Shin Godzilla 2 was stuck in limbo while Toho created a trilogy of anime Godzilla films for Netflix. Reports were that this was due to the contract with Legendary, which didn't allow them to produce more live-action Godzilla until 2020. Of course, 2020's entertainment plans were disrupted. The planned release of Godzilla vs. Kong was delayed due to the coronavirus. A double whammy for a marketing deal with Wizards of the Coast, whose monster-themed Magic the Gathering set had special alternate Godzilla tie-in cards, so there was no tie-in with the film. There was unfortunately an unintended tie-in. They had named one of the cards Space Godzilla Death Corona, and they had to fix them all at the last minute because a card called Death Corona while people were dying of corona was not the tie-in that they'd been hoping for. But what was notable about this is that of all the Godzillas to appear over the years, the Big G himself had only 3 incarnations that appeared in card form here. It was the original, it was the Return of Godzilla version, and Shin Godzilla. Despite having only one film, the monster had nevertheless made an impression. But it seemed that nevertheless, it was the end for him. Despite fans hoping for Shin Godzilla 2, by 2021 Toho announced that they would be using the shared universe idea popularized by the Marvel Cinematic Universe to justify taking the character back to his roots with World of Godzilla. Shin Godzilla just didn't seem to fit in with that. Its approach, its menace, and the ending of the film worked better if Godzilla was a lone monster threat and not just one of a plethora of monsters. But still, the film itself remains for us, and while the final shot may tantalize as fans still debate its significance, it does work as a standalone work. So tomorrow, we'll take a look at Shin Godzilla.